share my screen here. All right. So Ralph Vaughan Williams' Concerto for bass tuba, a staple for tubists, is one of the most important pieces of literature for tuba. As the first concerto ever written for tuba, it is an influential piece of music that showed the tuba as a serious solo instrument for the first time. Vaughan Williams' tuba concerto was not his most important or most influential, but elements used in this have been an influence for concertos to come. One composer and fellow Briton, Edward Gregson, took many elements from Vaughan Williams, including direct quotes from the concerto. Why would Gregson do this? Is it to pay homage to the composer of the very first tuba concerto, or is it to show his own nationalism? Who knows? Nonetheless, there are very few researchers who have analyzed and compared exactly how much influence Gregson took from Vaughan Williams. But in the following lecture, I intend to do just that by analyzing the Vaughan Williams concerto and comparing that with the Gregson concerto to show you exactly how much influence came from the Vaughan Williams. But before we delve into those analyses, we should probably take a brief look at the evolution of the tuba and how we ended up with a tuba concerto. The tuba's life has been very short compared to the rest of the instrument world. The modern tuba is not only the most recent instrument to gain entry as a standard member of the orchestral ensemble, but is also the last member of the brass family of instruments to be developed. The Industrial Revolution brought about new technologies that aided in the improvement of current musical instruments as well as the creation of new instruments. The pistons used in steam engines eventually made its way to the brass instrument world and brought with it new possibilities. In 1835, Wilhelm Wieprecht and Johann Gottfried Moritz of Berlin patented the bass tuba in F with 5 valves. The tuba was essentially a perfected version of its predecessor, the sax horns, ophicleides, and the serpents. This image here, that's somebody playing an ophicleide. They all function the same as the bass foundation in the ensemble. However, the tuba's large conical shape allows for a much broader, darker, and more present sound. The instrument found its home in brass bands and eventually took the ophicleide's place in the orchestra. Hector Berlioz is one of the first composers to use the tuba in place of the ophicleide and first specified a tuba part in his La Damnation de Faust in 1846. Because of the initial use of the tuba as, to provide bass support in a brass section, analogous to the double bass, there was little interest in writing solo music for it. In fact, there were only a few solo works written for tuba before the mid-20th century. Those works included Fantasy on a Popular Folk Song for Tuba by Eric Arcady, and When the Yuba Plays the Rumba on the Tuba Down in Cuba by Herman Hupfield in 1933. Though none of these works are considered as serious music, one can be noted that they were all written by American composers as opposed to German composers. Richard Wagner and Richard Strauss were both the first composers to attempt to explore the full ability of the tuba in the orchestra. In Wagner's Das Rheingold in 1869, he specified tuba parts to be played on both bass tuba and contrabass tuba, which had not been done until then. You can see over here on the part, there is a B, TB1 and F, TB2, that's a bass tuba, and then below there's CB tuba, which is the contrabass tuba. Strauss became the first to specify the use of mute in tuba in his Don Quixote in 1897. You can see that circled here, the Dampfer. Though composers were experimenting with new ways to implement the tuba in their compositions, solo literature for the tuba remained scarce. That is until 1945, when Ralph Vaughan Williams composed the first ever concerto for tuba. Ralph Vaughan Williams was an English composer from Gloucester, England. He studied at the Trinity College in Cambridge, as well as the Royal College of Music in London. In London, he studied under Sir Charles Stanford and Sir Hubert Parry, both major figures during the late 19th century in England. He later traveled from England to Berlin to study under Max Bruch, and then again to Paris to study under Maurice Ravel. In 1914, at the ripe age of 42, Williams joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, and then in 1918, the Royal Artillery during World War I. In 1940, during World War II, he became one of the first composers for film with his first film score for the propaganda film 49th Parallel. Williams is of the most prominent English composers, along with Gustav Holst, both which were key composers of the English musical Renaissance, a time that saw a nationalistic movement that sought to make more music that was distinctively English. His studies of English folk song and his interest in English music of the Tudor period fertilized his talent, enabling him to incorporate elements like folk song, medieval scales, and rhythmic freedom into a musical style that is at once highly personal and deeply English. With this idea in mind, he composed many musical works that utilize different folk song qualities. His works include 9 symphonies and other orchestral works, film scores, works for band, songs, operas, and many choral pieces. In 1954, Williams completed the very first tuba concerto, entitled Concerto for Bass Tuba. It was performed by soloist Philip Catalinet and the London Symphony Orchestra. This is a picture of Philip Catalinet and Vaughan Williams in his living room there. Philip here, he's demonstrating what the tuba can do while Vaughan Williams is compiling ideas for the concerto. As we move on to the analysis portion of this lecture, I want to share something from the textbook, A History of Western Music. One of his most popular works, Fantasia on the Theme of Thomas Tallis, in 1910 for double string orchestra and string quartet, is based on a Tallis hymn in the Phrygian mode that Vaughan Williams had revived for the English hymnal. This piece is based off a hymn in the Phrygian mode, which is very common in Williams' first movement, amongst other modes throughout the piece. Vaughan Williams' Concerto for Bass Tuba was written for the 50th anniversary of the London Symphony, and it was premiered on June 13, 1954, by the soloist Philip Catalinet and conductor Sir John Barbirolli. Vaughan Williams' reasoning for writing a tuba concerto is not entirely clear, but it is worth noting that the aging composer had written his Romance in D flat for harmonica only a few years before in 1951. Some think he was attempting to make certain instruments appear more serious, while others believed he was simply writing for novelty instruments. The real reason may never be known. The first movement of the Vaughan Williams Concerto is in sonata form. The movement can be divided into 3 major parts: an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. The exposition in this movement runs from the beginning until measure 55 with a brief 4-bar transition before this in 6/8. The development section runs from measure 55 until measure 103 with a transition from here until the recapitulation at measure 111. The first part here, the exposition, opens in F minor with the first 8th note motif that recurs multiple times in the piece. Let's give that a listen here. You can hear that motif was immediately followed by the main theme in the tuba line. Da-ba-da-da-da-da. The G flat is constantly showing up during this section, which gives it a Phrygian feel in F. When we reach rehearsal mark 1, measure 17, we find the tuba recycling the motivic material from the opening accompaniment line. Let's give that a listen. This motif and main theme are varied until the secondary theme at measure 31. This section is clearly in A minor. However, Williams uses a flat 5 and flat 2, which gives it a Locrian feel in A minor. The accompaniment recycles this theme at rehearsal 3 as it transitions us to the development at rehearsal 4, measure 51. The development is in B flat minor. However, the use of the occasional flat 1 maintains the modal feel. We also notice that the use of flat 2s, which is characteristic of Phrygian, just like the exposition. Another trick that we can see Vaughan Williams using here in the melody is a B flat minor pentatonic scale with B flat, D flat, E flat, F, and A flat. One thing to note about this section is that it is filled with triplet rhythms that starkly contrast the duple rhythms of the previous section. This is a signature of Vaughan Williams that occurs throughout the next two movements as well. This material is played around with until we reach measure 103 with a transition to the recapitulation at measure 111, just after rehearsal mark 7. The recapitulation reuses and varies the main theme of the movement. Just like the exposition, we see the utilization of flat 5 in F minor to maintain our modal Phrygian feel. At measure 129, we come back to the secondary theme in C minor instead of A minor this time. We modulate into B minor with the tuba ending with a cadence in B minor as the accompaniment continues to use the secondary theme as it transitions us into the cadence, or the cadenza, which returns to the original key of F minor. The use of G flat throughout the cadenza informs us that we are still in the Phrygian mode. Following a rhapsodic cadenza, the movement ends in F major with a Mixolydian 1 flat 7 1 cadence. The second movement, Romanza, is possibly one of the finest pastoral melodies ever written for any instrument and stands outside of the concerto as a complete work on its own. This beautifully lyrical movement allows the tuba to shine in ways that many would never expect such a large, bulky horn to. This movement is, though loosely in arch form, ABA. One would be inclined to say that this is, in fact, just simply ternary or rounded binary form because it is just ABA with contrasting sections. However, I would argue that because each section on its own has subsections that are drawn out, for example, there's A prime, A, B, B prime, B, A prime, A. We could call it arch form just because it just stretched out over a nice long arch. This is just my interpretation, but you are more than welcome to explore this further on your own. Unlike the first movement, we begin the second movement in a major key, the key of D major. The accompaniment opens with the ritornello that serves as an intro to the main theme in the tuba at rehearsal 1, measure 9. The main theme modulates to B minor at rehearsal 2, measure 18, and ends the period at measure 19 with a cadence in B minor. 2 measures later, we go back to D major at measure 21 with the tuba repeating the material from the ritornello, hinting again at the key of B minor as we head into D minor and the B section, or the poco agitato, in measure 26. I wasn't going to pity that much, but I really like that part, so there you go. The B section features a triplet 16th note embellishment of the opening material that contrasts the duple rhythms in the previous section, which is often performed at a slower tempo than the A section. The B section begins with the ritornello, but in the key of D minor. At measure 35, the key changes to put us in the key of A minor. The key change at 43 could allow us to think of 2 different modes, Aeolian or Dorian. The way that the tuba moves around E and B makes me think that we are in E Aeolian or E minor. Sorry, slow Wi-Fi. Rehearsal 5, measure 48 to the odd tempo, measure 53, serves as a transition back into the A section in B minor. The reiteration of the A section reuses the triplet 16th embellishments in small doses to differentiate this section A from the original section A. At rehearsal 6, we return back to the original key of D major with the main theme of the movement. We remain in D major until the very end of this movement, which concludes with an imperfect authentic cadence with the 5th A in the melody. Now to the last movement of this piece, Rondo alla Tedesca. Rondo alla Tedesca is very fast-paced when compared to the previous movements. This movement is in rondo form in F major and can be broken down into 2 episodes, each with its own contrasting melodic lines and a cadenza that ends the concerto. You see here, the tuba enters with ascending triplet flourishes that are reminiscent of the middle of the second movement. However, these have become a lot more urgent now. This triplet motif returns throughout the movement, utilizing the tritone in the F, B natural, G, C figures. Those occur both in the tuba and the accompaniment. This tritone allows us to hear this part in a Lydian mode with the raised 4. At rehearsal 1, measure 12, we are introduced to our secondary theme. Again, the contrast of duple to triple rhythms add the signature of Vaughan Williams to the melody. This lyrical melody also makes use of B natural, maintaining the Lydian feel. Rehearsal 2, measure 22, brings us back to our opening material in the accompaniment, which is embellished by the tuba several measures later with contrasting 16th note figures. This continues for a while until we arrive back to the original triplet flourishes that we see in the opening. We reach the second episode at the poco animato, measure 50, with what appears to be C minor. The tonality is not locked down to C minor as we have a lot of chromatic alterations. However, C flat is very common here, which could lead us to hear it as Lydian, like the previous episode, but with A flat and B flat to contrast the previous key. This section is also felt more easily in 1 than the previous section did. The second episode ends at rehearsal 7, measure 76, recycling the triplet flourishes in the accompaniment. At rehearsal 8, measure 83, the secondary theme is also recycled until just before the cadenza, where the theme from the second episode is used as a transition. All of the modal elements from the previous section are kept here. Before I go on, could I get a thumbs up from the audience just to make sure that we're still connected? Awesome, awesome, thank you. The cadenza reuses the main theme and secondary themes from the first episode in variations. The main theme is sequenced to keep us hearing that tritone, and the secondary theme is repeated in response as it echoes a few times. The accompaniment gives us the same triplet flourishes at the end of the first episode of the first period to drive us into a perfect authentic cadence in F to end the concerto. Now that we've gone through the Vaughan Williams concerto, we're going to move on to the Gregson. So Edward Gregson was born on July 23rd, 1945 in Sunderland, Codurnham, England. He studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London and then later at London University. Gregson, though lesser known, is a world-renowned composer whose music has been performed around the globe. His orchestral music has been performed by many orchestras and conductors worldwide, including all the BBC orchestras, the London Symphony, Royal Scottish National, Royal Liverpool Harmonic, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot. In 1976, Edward Gregson wrote his tuba concerto for the brass band and tuba. Gregson wrote his tuba concerto for the Bessies o' the Barn brass band. It's dedicated to this gentleman here, John Fletcher, who gave the inaugural performance on April 24th, 1976 in Middleton Civic Hall near Manchester, England. In 1978, an orchestral version was created and was finally performed in 1983 by John Fletcher and the Scottish National Orchestra, which was conducted by Sir Alexander Gibson at the Scottish Proms in Edinburgh, Scotland. The idea that the Gregson Concerto was directly influenced by Vaughan Williams' own concerto is not that far off. At the time of the inaugural performance of the Gregson Concerto in 1976, the only major composers who had written solo works for tuba were Vaughan Williams and Paul Hindemith with his own tuba sonata. Gregson's own nationality may have been a factor here as well, considering that both composers hail from England. It is possible Gregson utilizes Vaughan Williams' composition tactics, like modes and rhythms, to pay homage to the composer's nationalistic style. Now that we've gone through an analysis of Vaughan Williams' concerto for bass tuba, we can now analyze Edward Gregson's own concerto and start picking out similarities that show that Vaughan Williams was indeed an influence on his own concerto. When comparing the Gregson Concerto to the one by Vaughan Williams, the first thing that stands out is the striking similarity in form. Both of these works have a form that includes a fast first movement, a slow second movement, and a fast third movement. The movements of both these works are the first movements of both these works are sonata form. The second movements of these two are both arch form, though the Gregson second movement is much more easily identified as arch form. The third and final movements of each of these works are both rondo forms that contain 2 episodes and a cadenza towards the end of the movement. The beginning of the first movement opens with a fanfare-like melody in the accompaniment in C major that is repeated throughout the movement, both in the solo part and the accompaniment. At rehearsal 1, measure 16, the tuba comes in with the main theme here, this time outlining F instead of C like previously in the accompaniment. Just like Vaughan Williams, Gregson is creating a modal feel here by adding B flats throughout, making the beginning of this movement mixolydian. You see here the first figure, the top image here is the Gregson Concerto, and the bottom one is the Vaughan Williams. This figure here is reminiscent of the first melodic figure in the tuba in the Vaughan Williams first movement, which is also outlining F. In fact, if we were to remove the second 16th note from the figure in the Vaughan Williams melody, the rhythm would be identical to the Gregson as well. Gregson plays with this motif throughout the quasi-cadenza, moving through the keys of F, A, G, before the full ensemble rejoins the tuba in C with the original motif at rehearsal 2, measure 21. The A tempo at 2 sets the rest of the exposition into full speed. The same opening is played throughout the exposition using the occasional flat F sharp, giving it a Lydian feel at times to contrast the mixolydian. The cadence at rehearsal 3, measure 31, marks the beginning of the transition to the development section at measure 40. The development section introduces a second theme in G that is lyrical to contrast the fanfare that came before. This section uses C sharp more than any other chromatic alteration to give it a Lydian feel similar to the exposition. The melody here uses a quarter note emphasis that is similar to the secondary theme in the first movement of the Vaughan Williams Concerto. Also pay attention to the syncopated rhythm in the accompaniment. Here's the Gregson first. I'll compare that one with the Vaughan Williams melody. At rehearsal 5, measure 60, we expand on the main and secondary themes through sequencing until we reach the recapitulation at rehearsal 10, measure 128. Just before rehearsal 7, at measure 84, we can see a familiar melodic line and accompaniment. Let's give the Gregsons a listen here first. Now compare that similar figure to what's going on in the Vaughan Williams Concerto. The quote is brief, but it is immediately recognizable in both the melody and the accompaniment. The only difference is the Gregson is transposed up a step in the melody. The recapitulation at rehearsal 10, measure 128, revisits the main theme back in C major and features yet another quasi-cadenza that ends on a half cadence. The movement extends the ending using the main theme again, and finally ending with a perfect, authentic cadence. Though this movement does not have a true cadenza, it is worth noting that if the extended ending did not exist, the movement would end with a cadenza that restates the main theme, just like the Vaughan Williams first movement. Now to the second movement. The second movement is an arch form. It is A, B, C, B, A. The accompaniment begins the movement slow and ominously until the tuba comes in with the melody, in E flat minor, a key that is a minor third above the key of the previous movement. To compare this to the Vaughan Williams Concerto, the second movement is in D major, which is a minor third below the key of the first movement, which is F minor. It is interesting that the two composers not only chose to move in opposite directions, but also chose opposing modes for their first two movements. The poco primoso at rehearsal 14, measure 19, brings us to the B section in B flat minor, with the movement's main theme in a waltz style. The quicker tempo here can be felt in a slower one pattern, which would make this section feel tripletized, which contrasts this section with the previous section being duple, something that is reminiscent of Vaughan Williams. Both composers contrast this with the triple rhythms in the middle section of their second movements. Here we can see a better example of this in the C section, rehearsal 16. This section is contrasted with the return of the main theme in the B section, again at rehearsal 18. The ritardando leading into the molto maestoso here no longer allows us to hear the melody in one, but forces it to be obviously duple. The A section then returns at rehearsal 19, finally ending like the Vaughan Williams concerto did on a chord that lacks a sense of resolution, what appears to be an 11th chord with a D flat in the bass and an E flat in the melody. The third movement moves back to the key of C, the same as the first movement, just as Vaughan Williams also returned the third movement to F, the same key as his first movement. The beginning of the third movement opens with triplet flourishes similar to Vaughan Williams' third movement. Again, like the Vaughan Williams concerto, we see that the Gregson concerto uses chromatic alterations that make the movement feel like we are in the Lydian mode with a raised 4. This is the same mode as the Vaughan Williams concerto. The triplet flourishes build up tension until rehearsal 21, where we finally get to our main theme. The third movement's second episode begins at rehearsal 29 with a major stylistic change. We change to what seems to be a waltz style. There's very little that this section has in common with the Vaughan Williams other than this. The third movement of the Vaughan Williams concerto is entitled Rondo alla Tedesca, Tedesca being a style of German waltz. Gregson changing the style to a waltz here in the second episode could be an intentional hint at this from the Vaughan Williams concerto. rehearsal 32, we finally reach the cadenza. The cadenza almost has nothing in common with the Vaughan Williams until, however, you look at the alternative cadenza provided by Gregson on the very last page of the concerto. The alternative, just like the cadenza in the first movement of Vaughan Williams, pushes the range of the tuba to the extreme. The image here is the Gregson cadenza. The one on the right here is the Vaughan Williams. The Gregson cadenza holds on that high F, just like the Vaughan Williams cadenza, and even pushes up to the G flat and A flat in a similar fashion. In the Vaughan Williams cadenza, the lowest note is the low F, which is the bass tuba's fundamental. The Gregson's cadenza does not quite make it down that low, only going as far as a G sharp, which is an augmented second higher. The alternative cadenza in the Gregson concerto features 3 minor third leaps from D4 to F4. And though it is transposed down a minor third leap is undeniably reminiscent of Vaughan Williams. In the images below, we can see this is something clear, very clear, and has been obviously taken out of the Williams cadenza. Go away. So as you can see, Edward Gregson has taken a lot of inspiration from his fellow Vaughan Williams. We do not know exactly why he took so much inspiration, whether it was to pay homage to the very first tuba concerto or to his own nationalism, but the influence from Vaughan Williams is apparent. Through the forms, keys, and motivic material, we can see exactly how much influence concerto for bass tuba has had on the Gregson concerto. We see the ways that Gregson references Vaughan Williams and his concerto and proves the influential power that it has had on tuba literature. Now, I'll pay my own tribute to Ralph Vaughan Williams' Concerto for Bass Tuba with my own performance of the concerto to end our time here together. Thank you all for tuning in to, this evening, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I want to say first, I apologize for the sound quality. I don't have cache quality equipment here, so. Well, that was it. Thank you guys for joining. I'm gonna post this recorded session on YouTube. So if you guys wanna hit that like and subscribe button. But other than that, thank you guys for joining me tonight. Hope you guys have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.